All right, so we have now officially gotten the results from a pretty important special election that was taking place up in the state of Ohio, where voters took to the polls to decide whether or not to raise the threshold for direct ballot initiatives from 50% to 60%, and this was coming ahead of a November vote that's going to take place within Ohio on whether or not to enshrine abortion rights within this state, obviously coming at a time where the GOP-controlled state legislature has been passing extremely restrictive abortion measures. So this was a really weaselly situation that the Republicans tried to play here, where essentially they knew that this abortion vote was coming in November, and so they decided to break their own rules that they had previously set within this state and conducted this special election to take place in the middle of August, where they were hoping that it was going to be low turnout and people weren't going to be super energized about it, and they put this referendum to the voters within Ohio, and they overwhelmingly rejected it. So that threshold for this abortion vote in November is now going to stay at a 50%, a simple majority vote, in order to enshrine abortion rights within Ohio, instead of bumping that up to 60%. And I mean, again, it was super weaselly because the Republicans were literally looking at the polling data for this November abortion rights amendment that was being put forward, and it was literally having 58, 59% support within the state, and so they essentially were like, okay, let's take it from 50% to 60%. But obviously, the people of Ohio, again, were not having that shit. So here's the results. We have no getting a vote of 1.7 million, or 57%, and yes getting a vote of 1.3 million, or 43%. So again, not particularly close. It's also interesting when you get into some of the nuances of different portions of Ohio and how they ended up voting. One interesting thing that stood out to me here from Dave Wasserman, who's obviously constantly tracking this kind of stuff very closely, he says it looks like Ohio issue number 1, which is what this amendment was called, right, is going to fail in Delaware County, northern Columbus suburbs, which has voted Republican in every presidential race since 1916 and didn't even vote for Sherrod Brown in 2018. Okay, so again, even in places within Ohio that tend to skew Republican and have for decades and decades and decades, right, even some of those places were like, no, we want to keep this as it is. We want to be able to amend the state constitution with a simple majority, and we want to have the ability come November to actually make our voices directly heard and try to enshrine abortion rights within the state. So, I mean, again, you love to see it. This is why I'm typically in support of direct ballot measures like this. I mean, obviously, we have an incredibly corrupt and rotten political system here in the United States, both at the federal level and within a lot of these state legislatures. You also have a lot of these states, specifically like Ohio, that are extremely gerrymandered out the ass to the point where it's damn near impossible to try to get good legislation passed through these legislatures. And so direct democracy is a good way to skirt around that. We've had other examples of wild successes with left-wing policies like increasing the minimum wage. That was something that in the most recent presidential election that took place in the state of Florida, it obviously a very red state, but they overwhelmingly passed to raise their minimum wage, and that specific ballot measure actually got more support than either of the two presidential candidates on the ballot, Trump or Biden. So it gives you an insight in terms of where the American people actually stand on these very specific policy issues, which again, they're usually going to tend to come down on the right side of. So another thing that I saw floating across my timeline specific to this special election, which kind of just blew my mind that this is actually the messaging Republicans are going with in these scenarios or situations, as pointed out here by Benji Sarlin. He says, as Dave Weigel has tracked, Ohio, now one of the several abortion-related votes where the conservative ads are looking like this, still no sign of success with this message. So clearly it didn't work. We just saw the actual final results, but these are the kinds of ads that conservative groups are running when it comes to votes like this. Now keep in mind, okay, just for, a refresher here, right? This vote was specifically about whether or not to raise the threshold for amending the state's constitution from 50% to 60%, and then it was also tangentially about the vote that's coming up in November on abortion rights. This is the ad, this is the kind of ad that was running during that situation.
You keep the bad guys away. Protect her. Now's your chance. Out-of-state special interests that put trans ideology in classrooms and encourage sex changes for kids are hiding behind slick ads. Don't be fooled. You can keep this madness out of Ohio classrooms and protect your rights as a parent by voting yes on August 8th. Keep your promise. To her, vote yes on August 8th.
Okay, so like what the fuck was that? I mean, what did that have to do with the actual ballot measure here? I mean, again, issue 1 is about raising the threshold from 50% to 60% on amending the state constitution. And this advertisement was what? Trying to just like fearmonger with some suburban, wine moms or parents about how their kids are going to be attacked by the evil pedophile drag queen Democrats if they vote no on this measure. I mean, it's completely deranged. I mean, these are like full on insane advertisements that are being run. But this is sort of like the moment of the American, political culture that we are in right now, where it seems like conservatives, it seems like a lot of these reactionary Republicans cannot talk about any policy issue, cannot talk about literally anything without viewing it through the lens of like this anti-woke crusade that they are currently going on. And obviously, again, it doesn't seem like it's that appealing to a wide swath of the American people. Same reason why it seems like Ron DeSantis is doing worse and worse and worse the more that people hear this man speak. It's because, yeah, you can throw in some anti-woke shit, like Trump does on a regular basis. That'll be pretty appealing to some segment of the Republican base. But if this is your whole thing, if this is how you were trying to reach out to normie America, that shit is not going to fly. People are going to look at advertisements like this and be like, what are you even talking about? Like, what is this actually about? Is this vote about whether or not to have drag queens come in to force a sex change on my child? Like, no, that's not what this has to do with, right? But we continue here. So this was another interesting article that I saw, specifically giving us a little bit of context in terms of the fight over direct democracy, especially within a state like Ohio. So here from Politico, Joshua Zeitz, he says, today, voters in Ohio will go to the polls to deliberate on a change to the state's referendum law, backed by prominent Republicans and their patrons in the business community, particularly the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, which is basically just like the entity that represents corporate America. And this one is specifically the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, but generally the Chamber of Commerce within the United States. That's their goal. They represent business interests in the U.S. And these are the kinds of, organizations or institutions that were backing this amendment vote, right? Obviously, they are anti-democracy. They don't want to make it, easy for people to actually, try to directly vote on things that could benefit their lives and potentially harm the interests of corporate America, right? But they say the initiative would raise the bar required to secure amendments to the state's constitution. Since 1912, when Ohio joined other states in adopting the referendum system, voters have been able to bypass a state legislature and amend the constitution by simple majority, which again is vitally important when you have increasing, polarization and increasing gerrymandering within these states, where again, like, you take a state like Wisconsin, for example, that is so gerrymandered that Democrats would literally have to win in the aggregate about like 65% of the vote in order to get a simple majority within the legislature. Like, it's completely rigged at that point, right? So you have to use some sort of attempts to work around, and this just happens to be one of those. But they say it's little mystery why Ohio Republicans snuck a late initiative onto the ballot just months after the GOP-dominated legislature passed a law banning the August referenda at the local level on the reasonable grounds that voter participation rates are lower during the dog days of summer. So, I mean, again, they broke basically the outline of their own rule. They were trying to say, well, we shouldn't have these kinds of massively important referendums during, the first couple weeks of August because those are going to be low voter turnout. But okay, now we're, actually having something that could benefit the Republican agenda. So now we're just going to bump this up to August and break our own rules, right? So they say in 2019, the heavily gerrymandered legislature passed a deeply unpopular bill prohibiting abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy before many women know that they are even pregnant, without exceptions for rape or incest. Without exceptions. So 6-week abortion ban with no exceptions is pretty much as extreme as you could get, right? They say the law is currently on hold pending judicial review, and in response, reproductive rights advocates secured enough petition signatures to put a referendum before the voters this November, and if that passes, abortion rights, as I pointed out, will be enshrined in the Constitution, and the state legislature is not going to be able to fuck with that. They say given current polling, Republicans are expected to lose the November vote, so they're trying to change the rules mid-game. The gambit is so transparent that even two former GOP governors, Robert Taft and John Kasich, have come out in opposition of this move that they tried to pull here. Again, thankfully it wasn't successful, but this is basically why they're trying to do this. So they say once a swing state, Ohio has grown steadily redder in recent years, but it is also one of the most extreme cases in legislative and congressional gerrymandering in the country. By drawing maps that stack the decks in their favor, engaging in wide widespread voter registration purges that disproportionately affect young and minority voters and making it harder to register altogether, the legislative majority, even in defiance of the state Supreme Court, which has ruled some of these practices unconstitutional, has ensured for itself a lasting supermajority, seemingly in perpetuity. They say, but in attempting to ram an unpopular abortion ban down the voters' throats and their cynical attempt to change the way referendums operate to preserve that widely detested law, the GOP majority may have overplayed its hand, and obviously, according to the results that we saw, they definitely did. Now, just real quick, a little bit of insight in terms of how some of these tactics actually play out on the ground in terms of trying to suppress the vote. I think that this was a good point here made by Michael McDonald. They say when Democrats talk about election rigging, they mean things like this. Ohio Republicans only allow one early voting location per county. The predictable result is that you're going to have long lines in suburban or in urban areas, and we all collectively shrug and say that this is okay. And I think that that's an important point here, right? And there's obviously a video showing how absurdly long the voting lines were for this referendum vote. And so I think that's a good and an important point, right? When, you know, a leftist like myself comes out and says the Republicans are trying to rig elections, we don't mean that in the same way that Donald Trump means that, right? Donald Trump literally means that, like, Venezuelan communists are hacking into our election software and changing votes from Trump to Biden, okay? That's not what we're talking about. He's talking about that's the way that, you know, these elections are being rigged against me. What we're talking about is basically these policies, these moves that Republicans make in order to try to make it more difficult for people to register to vote, more people to actually, or to be able to vote in different kinds of ways, like with mail-in ballots, making it more difficult for people to actually show up and vote, limiting the amount of early voting days, things like that actually depress the vote, right? It's a completely different allegation here, but you can actually see it play out in an election like this. And obviously, this isn't the first time we've seen this happen in somewhat red states. We also had this story from late last year in August, or I guess that's an entire year ago at this point. Jesus Christ, time is flying by. But just as a reminder here, they say voters in Kansas decide to keep abortion legal in the state, rejecting an amendment. So, I mean, even in a state like Kansas, even in a state like Ohio, it seems like Republicans have kind of shot themselves in the foot in terms of moving forward with this as one of their major issues. And I mean, this is obviously going to be one of the key issues going into the 2024 presidential campaign, which kind of gives Democrats a little bit of a layup, obviously. I mean, I think they're much more on the right side of this. I think that there could have been significantly more to try to push back against, the overturning of Roe v. Wade and sort of, pushing back against like Ruth Bader Ginsburg refusing to retire back under the Obama administration. So many different things we could point out that could have potentially tried to prevent us from getting to the position that we are in right now. But this is just one of those issues where it's like Democrats are going to get a couple percentage point bump just because Republicans decided to plant their flag in the ground and draw a line in the sand on such a deeply, deeply unpopular position. So, I mean, again, credit to all the people who actually got this done in Ohio. Obviously, this is just the beginning of that process. You're going to have to still go out and vote in November, and I'll put information down below if you want to get the specific voting day and how you're going to go vote, and all of that information as well. But show up to vote in November, because that's the only way you are going to be able to circumvent these gerrymandered state legislatures and actually try to protect people's rights.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying